Okay, this is lesson 3 in Math 113, which is due on April 2nd. And again, you can text those to Mrs. Bishop, and I will grade them for you. When we were in Math 112, and we had the square root of a negative number, we said there was no solution. It was not a member of the real number system, which is true. However, now I'm going to teach you a new concept, which says that the square root of negative a is equal to the square root of a times the square root of negative 1. And now I'm going to define the square root of a negative 1 is equal to I, which is an imaginary number. And while we're here, I want to reiterate that when you have the square root of x times the square root of x, that's equal to x. Therefore, when you have the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of a negative 1, that's going to be equal to negative 1. So when you have I squared, it's going to be negative 1. Okay, so if I have in example A, the square root of negative 49, I'm going to break that down into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 49. We identified the square root of negative 1 as I. We know that the square root of 49 is 7, so the answer is 7I. Always put your number in front of the I. My example B is the square root of negative 50. Once again, I'm going to separate them into negative 1 and 50, the square roots of those. So now I need to break that 50 down into 25 times 2. We know that this is I, and if I have 25 times 2, I can take out a 5. Square root of 25 is 5. So my answer would be 5I times the square root of 2. Now we're going to look at what happens when we add a real number to an imaginary number. We can't combine them because they're not like terms. And by the way, you all have access to Mr. Trick's notes on Math 113, and he has some very interesting little notes about the history of an imaginary number and so forth. So you might want to look at those if you haven't already. So if I have something like 5 plus 6I, and notice the real number comes first, that's called a complex number. And you can add or subtract those. So if we have, this is on concept 15, example A. If we have 5 plus 6I, in parentheses, plus 4 subtract 3I, the plus here isn't going to change any thing in there, so I can just say, well, I have a real number here, a real number here, so that would be 9. I have an imaginary number here and an imaginary number here. So 6 subtract 3 would be a positive 3I. And then once again, you cannot put those together, so that is your answer. On B, it is 2 subtract 3I, subtract 3 plus 5I. Notice this is a negative sign, so I'm going to distribute it here, and it's going to make a negative 3 and a negative 5I. Bring this down like it is, 2 subtract 3I. Now, real number here, real number here. 2 subtract 3 is -1. Imaginary number, imaginary number. -3 plus a -5 would be a -8i. And that, my friend, would be your answer. Moving on, we're going to be multiplying these complex numbers, and we can FOIL or we can distribute, but always remember that I squared is equal to -1, like I mentioned a while ago. So on the next concept, 16, example A is 5i times 2i. 5 times 2 is 10. I times I is I squared. We know that I squared equals what? Yes, -1. So now I have -1 times 10, which is equal to -10. And that's my answer. On example B, I have 3i times 2 subtract 3i. I'm going to distribute here, and 3 times 2 is 6i, and 3i times 3i times a -3i will be a -9i squared. I squared equals -1. So a -1 times a -9 would be a +9, and then plus 6i, and that would be your answer. Always put your real number first. C. On this one, it's 4 plus 2i times 6 subtract I. Okay, we're going to FOIL. 4 times 6 is 24. And then the outer 4 times a -i would be -4i. And then our inner would be plus 12i. And our last would be -2i squared. I can put these guys together and get 8i, and then bring my 24 down, plus 8i. -I squared is equal to -1, so -1 times a -2 would be a +2. So then I have two real numbers here, so it's going to be 26 plus 8i. All right, moving on to the next example, example D. Try to get it over there. It's 2 plus 7i squared. And you can rewrite this as 2 plus 7i times 2 plus 7i if that makes it easier for you to FOIL. And when you FOIL that, you're going to get 4 plus 28i plus 49i squared. I squared, remember, is -1. So now I have 4 subtract 49 plus 28i. So it would be -45 plus 28i, and that would be your answer. So I have one more section here, dividing numbers, where we have to rationalize the denominator. The denominator cannot be have a radical on it, and it cannot have an imaginary number on it. So let's make that little note here so you don't forget. Denominator, that's the bottom number on a fraction, cannot have a square root or have an I in it. You must rationalize the denominator. So, a 2 over 3i. We're going to multiply by 3i over 3i. 3 times 3 is 9. I times I is I squared. And on the top, we're going to have 2 times 3 is 6i. We know here that I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 times 9 is equal to negative 9. And on the top, we have 6i, which is fine to have an I on the top, just not on the bottom. So both of these will divide by 3. 6 divided by 3 is 2i. Negative 9 divided by 3 is negative 3. So your answer is negative 2/3 I. And the last example, B. 5 plus I over 3 minus 4i. Here we're going to use the conjugate, which the conjugate, if you remember, is the opposite sign. And so we'll have 3 plus 4i and 3 plus 4i. Okay, so when you have the conjugate, the middle terms always cancel because that's why we chose that. So all we're going to have is the first two, which is 3 times 3 is 9. And the last two, which is negative 16i squared. I squared is a negative 1. Negative times a negative is a positive. So in reality, you have 9 plus 16, which is equal to 25. So when we get finished, the denominator is going to be 25. Now let's FOIL those top two. 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times 4i is 20i. And I times 3 is 3i. And the last two is 4i squared plus 4i squared. We can combine these two. Let's do that. Put it down here, 23i. I squared is what? Yes, negative 1. Negative 1 times 4 is negative 4. So 15 subtract 4 is 11 plus 23i over 25. And that is your answer. Now you should have the information you need to do all of lesson 3. And again, it's due April 2nd. If you need help, feel free to text me. You guys have a great weekend.